It's the US elections, and what matters most are numbers, polls. Are they stacking up in favor of Trump or Kamala Harris? To talk a little more about this, being joined by the president of Ipsos, Clifford Young. Clifford is somebody who has been working on numbers. Ipsos has been putting out poll data almost on a daily basis on various issues. Clifford, thank you so much for joining us here on the India Today Network. Let's just begin with the most important aspect of polling. When you're looking at poll numbers, what is the criteria? What are the issues that you focus on? And what are the issues that really matter this election?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so the first thing we primarily focus on are what are those things people are worried about. Because the number one issue is typically what defines the election. So the huge question is, what is the number one issue for Americans? It's inflation, it's the cost of living, and it has been over the last couple of years since COVID. And we find that that's an issue at the national level, as well as in those 6 key swing states. And let me explain that. In the United States, it's not about popular vote. It's about 50 separate state elections. And there's really only 6 states that are competitive. And we're focused on those 6. And the key issue there is inflation.
That's a very important one because we have been looking at the stories that are now doing the rounds. The Republicans are really working on, and this is maybe a disadvantage, Clifford, for Kamala Harris because she is part of the incumbent administration, that they're doing a comparison of the price index when it comes to the Trump era as opposed to the Biden administration and how prices have increased. How much would that really impact? And this is a campaign strategy. But how do you think that is going to impact the swing states, particularly so because, like you very rightly explained, the blues are blues, the reds are reds, but it's the swing states. How are these stacking up of the price indexes, inflation index, really going to impact the elections here?
Yeah, that's a great question. Once again, it's inflation that's the number one issue, especially in the swing states. Donald Trump has a lead there, about by 7 points. Now, Harris has eaten into that lead. But what's very, very interesting about this election is while Donald Trump dominates the fundamentals, that is the political fundamentals, he dominates the number one issue, Harris is still slightly in the lead. And so we have this like puzzle going on that on the one hand, she's doing better than we would otherwise have thought. And Trump is doing worse than we would have otherwise thought. And coming out of the debate, nothing really has changed in respect to that. And so what we're especially focused on right now is the relative or efficiency of each campaign. How well each campaign can hammer home the message. Can Trump focus on inflation and he's the inflation savior? Can he paint Harris as just another Biden, just another animal of the government, of the establishment? And can Harris show people that she's empathetic to their economic plight? And so that is really the dispute right now. That is really the battle. Who's going to win the war of messages?
Okay. This presidential election is not a walkover anymore, as it seemed to be just before Kamala Harris was nominated. Having said that, did the presidential debate make any difference to where the polls are, where the numbers are?
Yeah, that's a great question. So without a doubt, Biden stepping out and Harris stepping in energized the Democratic base. She's doing better than Biden was doing relative to Trump. That's undeniable.
That goes without saying.
Yeah, exactly. It's a different race, by the way. It's everyone's pause in the United States. Americans are reflecting once again, and the debate is a great metaphor, I would say, for the campaign itself. It really showed which candidate was more effective at getting forward their message. I would say Harris was more able to than Trump. All the polling suggests that she won that debate. Now, if it changes the numbers or not, that's another question. We're going to have to wait another week But without a doubt, she's much more on message. That is, Harris is much more on message today than Trump is.
Okay. But then there are incidents that really can change the way an election is moving forward. We had the first assassination bid. We have a second one now. What how, how do you that impact? Will the date of the poll numbers change because of this second attempt?
Yeah, that's we really don't know, right? We're really in unprecedented times. I mean, we've had two assassination attempts. We've had a debate debacle on the Biden side. We've had a switch around or switch over in the candidate. I think we just have to wait and see. Will Trump have a bump? I think that there's been so much that's gone on. Probably not. But once again, it goes to the uncertainty of this electoral season.
Haitian immigrants. While we know immigration and immigrants or illegal immigrants, they're all issues, particularly illegal immigrants, is an issue this election. The fact that there has been a narrative that has been set by the Republicans, by the Trump-Vance camp, countered by the Democrats. But in terms of where they're trying to target, who they're trying to target, Clifford, how do you see when I saw Trump use it during the debate? I actually thought that was a huge disaster. But if you see how they're trying to push it forward, it just seems like he was trying to make a point at the debate and carry it forward. So how do you see this entire thing? Is this strategy, or was that a mistake? And how has that impacted the elections?
Yeah, so basically, immigrants eating cats and dogs, right? And so it's in part it's a caricature, right? It probably was over the top, but it goes to a fundamental issue. If the number one issue is inflation, a close second or third is immigration. That has been an issue that Trump has used effectively. He uses it to mobilize the Republican base. He won on that in 2016. And he was just doubling down on the issue once again. He was trying to use a proof point, whether it was real or not, that's another issue. Fake news or not, that's another issue. But for his base, it wasn't ineffective, right? It just went to one of many examples that they have in their mind of immigration negatively affecting America. And so I would say that the primary division, the primary social cleavage in the United States today is along the issue of immigration, of attitudes of nativism, that is, preferring native-born over foreign-born. And Trump has used it quite effectively till now, even if maybe it's become a social media meme already. What he said specifically, more generally, it's one of his key issues.
Okay. There are many other key issues, but let's just go look at a few things one by one. Gun violence. We've seen two assassination attempts, and yet we know where Trump stands when it comes to gun violence or gun lobby and gun laws. But Kamala Harris is also no different, Cliff.
Yeah, in terms of, well, on the gun issue, they're different, right? The Democrats, including Harris, want certain sort of regulations that minimize gun exposure and gun violence. That's different than specifically, it's different than Trump. She might own a gun, but she has very different position relative to Trump on guns. But I would say that guns are not the primary driver right now. It's an important issue. Ultimately, on the margins, it reinforces especially Harris's, but also Trump's position and credibility relative to their base. But it is not a primary driving issue today. That is specifically, as we've already said, is inflation.
Okay, but reproductive rights is. That's a driving issue. Abortion bans are a driving issue. And the positions have been taken. They're quite strong. He was a bit on the back foot here in the debate as well. Kamala Harris asserted herself on what it means. But in terms of numbers, how much of the women voters are actually looking at the Democrats because of their position on reproductive rights?
Yeah, that's a great question. So obviously abortion's important, especially today after the Supreme Court decision of a few years ago. But it doesn't rise to the level of inflation. But
Not
on
at
the
all.
margins, it is important. It reinforces Harris's credibility. She's very strong on the issue. You could see that in the debate. She gained energy. She gained steam as she talked about it. And I would say the following. I think that where the issue is on the ballot, where there's a abortion referendum question, like in Florida, that could sway some of the elections, not just presidential, but some of the other elections, like for senator. But, you know, for the most part, I would say it's an issue that might get the Democrats a half a point here, a quarter point there. Once again, it's not the primary issue, but it could sway the election because in these six key swing states, we're maybe talking about 200,000 votes. We're not talking about a huge difference. And, you know, ultimately, those moderate Republican women that live in suburbs in the key swing states, they could be important. So we can't discard it as a relevant and ultimately potentially defining issue.
Take us through the swing states, Clifford, and just tell us what your numbers are looking like in the swing states today.
Yeah, so we have, let's just say for the sake of argument, there's six. There's a debate whether it's six or seven, but let's just say six for the sake of
Okay,
argument.
let's just go with the six.
Yeah, let me just go through them, okay?
Yeah.
So we have three swing states in the Midwest, or we call the Rust Belt. That's where we had the former sort of industrial sort of infrastructure there, and that's Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And then we have three more that are sort of in the South and in the West, and then we have Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia. And what I would say is the following: conventional wisdom said that the Democrats had to have those three key swing states in the Midwest, in the Rust Belt. The Republicans needed the three in the South that I named, plus North Carolina. And they're all very close, especially in the Rust Belt. She has Harris has a slight lead. It's a tie there to a slight lead for Harris in the Western and Southern swing states. Trump has a slight lead, but it's all close to 50-50. These ultimately, it will go down to the wire. It'll go down to the end. And both campaigns are battling it out.
And as not just a pollster, as somebody who's been watching elections for so long, what happens should Kamala Harris be declared winner?
That's a great question. And so the huge question is, what will happen on the day after? And here in the United States, like all over the world, by the way, Ipsos tracks opinions all over the world, including India. What do we know just generally about the world? It's a widespread belief that the system is broken, that parties and politicians no longer worry about the average person, that the system is rigged, and therefore there's a need for a strong leader. And that's an orientation, that's a set of attitudes that we see everywhere, including the United States. And that goes to confusion, right? There's a high likelihood, ultimately, that a certain subset of Republicans, including Trump, don't accept the results. And obviously in democracy, peaceful transfer of power is critical. It's critical for the opposition, that is the losing side, to accept the elections. And I think there's a likelihood. Now, our polling also suggests that a majority of Americans would accept the election, though also a majority of Republicans saying probably it won't be fair. So again, uncertainty, confusion. I think there's a likelihood of having confusion
unrest?
Like we had in 2000. I wouldn't go as far as saying the mess, because the machinery of the state, at least at the federal level, is controlled by the Biden administration. It's not controlled by Trump anymore. Maybe we have less. Doesn't mean we don't have protests. It doesn't mean we don't have court cases all over the place. But I think there's a likelihood of something. Yeah.
And what happens if Trump is declared winner? Would the transition be smooth? Would there be questions? And would there be more chaos in courts then?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because I think we often overlook that. In other words, everyone, analysts and pundits and news people tend to sort of look at Trump and what he did and sort of extrapolate out to this election. But I think there could be potentially confusion on the other side too. That widespread belief that the system is broken is held by both sides. Now, I don't know if you're going to have orchestrated protests like you did on the Republican side in 2021, but definitely the court, the court process, court cases, stopping up the system. That's a high likelihood. So I think on both sides there'll be attempts to question the other side's legitimacy. Maybe one side more vociferously, that is on the Republican side, and maybe on the Democratic side, it's more technical. But I think overall, we live in an America today that doesn't trust the other side.
Okay, let's zoom out a little because Ipsos does a lot of polls and gets a lot of numbers in. How's the world reacting to the US elections? What's the opinion that you're picking up from across the world? What are they saying?
That's a great question. Now, the whole world is watching, and I'm doing an interview right now, talking to Indian viewers. But I do a lot of these sorts of interviews with interested parties all over the world. I've traveled a lot. I've gone on a number of tours to talk about the election in different places. So there's a lot of interest. Obviously, it's very important. It affects politics. It affects business globally. That's the first point. So like among decision makers, it's very, very important. What do people think about the election? Because we've run those polls as well. For the most part, globally, people are in favor of the Democratic candidate, now specifically Harris, relative to Trump. There's a few outliers there that are in favor of Trump, like Russia as an example. But for the most part, if the world could vote, they would more likely vote for Harris than they would for Trump. But obviously they don't vote in the United States.
Okay, there are a lot in India also maybe who would be looking at Trump. Now, given the affinity and the kind of we've seen the kind of coverage that Modi Trump have had, every time they've met, and that's the reason why. Having said that,
yeah. Listen, there's in India, our data suggests that there's a tendency towards Harris among Indians rather than Trump. But I think you point out something very interesting. I think Modi and Trump have very similar characteristics. They're about the anti-establishment. They're questioning the establishment. That's a trend we're seeing, as I said before, globally. You can think of Bolsonaro in Brazil. You can think of Modi in India. You can think of Le Pen in France. They all have their different flavors. They're a little bit different from place to place, but they're all questioning the system. And I would say just that global citizens today are in a surly mood. They're not in a happy mood, and they're questioning the powers that be.
That's absolutely true, Clifford. Now, before I let you go, there is one aspect, and you say that a lot of Indians do look at Harris, which is absolutely true, is because also of her Indian roots. How much of the debate or the questions or the searches have been on what is Kamala Harris's race? Because let's accept it, they just throw something at you, and then the world is spinning around the very same questions that have been thrown by the Republicans. Kamala Harris's race was one of those such false narratives. But how many people actually then started looking at Kamala Harris, and how many people have looked or searched for Kamala Harris, trying to know who she is? The fact that a lot of people in America also don't really know or knew Kamala Harris well enough.
Yeah, that's a great question as well. And Kamala Harris has gone through a period of introducing herself to the American population, and indeed, even during the debate, she was doing that. Now, that's a very standard strategy for any campaign: is first to introduce the candidate, talk about their biography, who they are, their background. And to emphasize that. Now, even though her name recognition was about equivalent to that of Trump's, it was very hollow. People didn't know the specifics. Now, when it comes to her race, she's biracial, obviously. We're in the middle of a culture war right now in the United States. And that culture war finds its sort of division one we talked about already in terms of immigration. but also just in terms of sort of values, right? We have one America that sees the world as more diverse, more cosmopolitan, that looks towards the future. And Harris represents that. She is the quintessential diverse individual of a diverse candidate. And we have another America that's worried about an old America slipping away. They want to go back to the past. It's, let's make America great again, obviously, is Trump's slogan and mantra. And this race is all about that. It's all about an increasingly diversified America, racially and ethnically, relative to America that once was, which was primarily white and uni-ethnic, let's say. And it's playing out in front of our eyes today. And part of the criticisms of Trump is her sort of questionable racial identity, which kind of goes specifically to this culture war that we're seeing playing out in the campaigns at this point.
Again, because we're talking about multiculturalism, multi-ethnicity, acceptance, so on and so forth, does it help that J.D. Vance has an Indian origin wife?
I don't think necessarily, but not in terms of electoral gains, let's say. But it is interesting indicator of where we're going as a nation, as a society. I mean, it's even on the conservative side, we have a multi-ethnic family that's in the mix in terms of the presidential race. And so I think it's much more of an indicator of where we're going and what America is becoming than anything about specifically whether that helps Trump electorally.
Celebrity endorsement, how do you think that really stacks up for either candidate? And when I say celebrity, it's not just a Taylor Swift, although that was one of the biggest endorsements, but an Elon Musk, a billionaire influencer, owns X or erstwhile Twitter. How do these endorsements really stack up for the leaders? What do your numbers really tell you? And particularly Swift, has that really changed anything for Kamala Harris?
Yeah, and so I would say typically celebrity endorsements only is worth one vote. Not much more. I might help a little bit of it in terms of a halo, but that doesn't mean that in specific instances that an individual can have some sort of marginal impact. Now, when it comes to Taylor Swift, obviously she's a megastar. In some ways, she has much more of a positive image than Elon Musk, who has a questionable brand relative to the general population. Right, he's seen as sort of conservative, and he's seen as irreverent and a little bit problematic. Whether she's able to get people out to the polls, young people out to the polls, many registered as a function of her requesting to do so. Our experience is typically young people don't vote. But we will see. It's not a bad thing. It's either a net neutral or net positive for Harris when it comes to.
Okay, final question to you, Cliff. Gen Z votes, how are they going to impact the elections? We saw the midterm elections. They really came out in numbers, especially supporting the Democrats, so Biden. So how do you see the Gen Z factor this time around? They are quite politically aware and active, but is that activism in the streets really going to translate into votes in the ballots and into states coming one way or the other for the Democrats or the Republicans?
Yeah, that's that's always a question. Every electoral season, will the young people show up? They tend to be more liberal than conservative. They tend to help Democrats more than Republicans here in the United States. But they vote at much lower rates. What we can say is the following: that with the entry of Harris into the race and Biden stepping out, that segment, that constituency, was seriously energized. So at least on social media, they kind of went crazy, right? And the Harris campaign has been very effective at connecting with them, and it's very obvious. Whether that translates into them going and voting, that's the huge question. I would say they're always a little bit of a disappointment relative to their size, but it's true. But just historically speaking, but we will see, right? This is a strange electoral season. Unprecedented, as I already have said. So many things have happened. who knows? It might be
No,
Gen Z
but
that finds it.
but yeah, absolutely, because we have been following Kamala headquarters, which is absolutely focusing its energies on the brats or what we call Gen Z, on the younger lot. They are absolutely focused on that. But does Trump really have a Gen Z weapon? Because I don't see that apart from one-off story that comes on Barron Trump, sorry, Barron Trump coming out and engaging with some of the influencers. There isn't a hook for Gen Z when it comes to Trump.
Yeah, they don't have a strategy. That is not their target constituency. Republicans are not focused on young people typically. They're focused on older people. They vote much more. That always gives Republicans a slight advantage, everything else being equal. It makes total sense that the Harris campaign is completely focused on young people. They are more aligned from a values and policy perspective with them. The question will be activation. Can they get them out to vote? And that's a huge question mark. And obviously the campaign itself has thought a lot about that. They have strategies both on social media and in reality and in physical space to go out there and knock on doors to get people out. But ultimately, historically speaking, young people have voted at lower rates than what they represent in the population.
And in your appreciation, do you think voting percentages could change, vary this time around from the past? Could it increase, or is it going to be as has normally been the case with the American voting percentage?
I think it's going to be very close. A landslide in the United States is 5 points. And so any state that's showing 7, 8, 9, or any national polls like showing more than 6 is off. Probably it's going to be close like always, but ultimately the race will come down to who shows up. It's always the case, and that both campaigns are focused on activating their base to get them out to the polls.
Yes, we're seeing a lot of merchandise now asking people to come out and vote, whether it's Kamala camp or the Trump camp. Clifford, yeah, thank you so much for joining us and breaking this election down for our viewers. A lot of them have a lot of questions on US elections, but thank you so much for doing this. We'll probably try coming back to you a little later and closer to the elections to understand furthermore as to where we are headed, where the US is headed, certainly, in terms of the election. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was great.